Hi, this is Nikita Petrov speaking to you from a field in Russia. It's in the middle of nowhere. The next village here is called Novoye Veretie or New Veretie. A dying Russian village of like 10 households now, and most of those are abandoned for most of the year. The nearest little town is called Ostrov, which translates as an island, because it's on an island. It's an ancient little town, actually. It's, I think, 700 years old or so. And has a population of 20,000 people, I think. Not a lot of things happening there. There's a statue of Lenin, there's a church, a park. I haven't seen much else. Oh, there's a famous old bridge, I think. Anyway, I escaped here from St. Petersburg, which is the second largest city in the country, because of this COVID-19 situation. And today's episode is about how the Church of Scientology is adjusting to the same issue. And that's kind of the premise, that's the reason I reached out to Tony Ortega, who's the guest today, who's been on the show before, who's been covering the Church of Scientology for a quarter of a century now. I decided to talk to him now because this is a rare situation when my concerns and your concerns and the concerns of Scientologists have a lot in common. We all are adjusting to this new reality that involves people in masks and invisible health dangers and restrictions on human interaction, and this is uncommon. Usually Scientologists exist in a kind of a parallel reality, or a reality bubble, you might say, meaning their concerns is not what you see in the news. As Tony put it, Scientologists don't care who the president is. Right now what's on the news is what everybody has to adjust in some way, and Scientology is unhappily, reluctantly adjusting to the pandemic as well. So that's the premise for today's conversation. I should also mention that I've had Tony on the show 3 times before, and in those earlier conversations we went into considerable detail about the sort of the fundamentals of Scientology, the history of the church, its practices, its structure, psychological forces that seem to be at work within the organization, how it functions, why some people come into that organization, why some of them stay, why even a smaller number climb that ladder or go up the bridge, in their lingo, of ever more expensive courses. Those earlier ones, I think, are some of the best really overviews of what the Church Scientology is about. And I'm now turning those into writing. The working title is The Meaning of Scientology. That'll be published on psychopolitica.com, which is where I publish my newsletter. The premise there is, I think, it's more than a curious story. Scientology and all of these other strange groups and communities and belief systems, they're worth studying because they're curious, but also because if you look at them, you know, it's all about humans. It's all the same psychological forces are at work there as in other groups and other ideologies. So by studying, let's say, cults, you might learn something about cultish behavior and thinking, and maybe you'll recognize some patterns there that are present in your group, or in something that is happening in the world or in the country. You'll just be a little better at recognizing the power dynamics and the various tricks that people use to get control over other people. So psychopolitica.com is where that will be published. Currently it's just like my writing and my drawings, but now there will be these interviews too, with an added layer of my interpretation, thought, and even experiences. I've been to the Church of Scientology, really. I went to their Moscow center 2 times with a kind of anthropological interest, and I've been to other strange gatherings and done some strange practices. So it will all factor in somehow. So in about a minute I'm gonna play this interview that I recorded in April with Tony Ortega. Before that, I'm gonna run a little excerpt from an audio that Tony published on his site. It's a leaked recording in which a Scientology ship commander is giving a pep talk to Scientologists in New Zealand, Oceania, and Australia. Scientology, for historical reasons, they have this like pretend fleet, pretend navy. So they have ships, and one of these ships has this particular woman as a commander, and she gives this pep talk. The segment I'm gonna run is very short. It starts with her quoting the founder of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, and then she gives her 2 cents on the situation. So you'll hear her now, and then after that, it's my conversation with Tony Ortega that we recorded in April 2020. Take care.
The best way to know any future is to cause one. And that's why, you see, when you start consulting the oracle at Delphi, you've taken a step downhill. You've assigned cause for the future elsewhere. One predicts the future as much as one is cause. The future isn't a pattern laid out to abuse and bully you. The future is a beautiful playground that nobody happens to be combining. You talk about virgin territory. The most virgin territory there is the future. You can do anything you want with it. Nobody is doing anything with it. LRH. We can totally predict our future by our actions right now. Getting all your selectees selected for their next services, getting them to sign up for their next services with your local registrars, getting people to sign up for extension courses. But the main thing is being cause and not going effect of some pandemic that's really just simply suppressive and antisocial to begin with. I think we need to just take it out. Just take it out and take it down. And we're going to be doing that by creating future.
The kind of trigger, not maybe the reason, but the trigger for me to actually reach out to you and propose another conversation is this coronavirus thing.
Yeah.
I thought it'd be interesting to see, how these two strange realities, the Scientology one and our common one that we're all experiencing now, intersect. And you've been writing about it on the site. So what is the Church Scientology? How are they approaching this? How are they reacting?
Well, the timing was interesting because things were starting to get really noticeable in the news. That second week of March is when people were starting to make some decisions about, is this going to be a big deal here? Do we have to do something? And that happened to coincide with Scientology's holiest date on their calendar of the year, which is March 13th, L. Ron Hubbard's birthday. And Scientology has like 4 or 5 large international events every year. And this is the most important one. It's LRH birthday event. It's held at Ruth Eckerd Hall in Clearwater, Florida. And it was scheduled for that Friday night, March 13th. And I saw some things that led me to believe that they were going to go ahead and do it no matter what. And that was the week, I think the event that really got people to realize that they had to take this seriously was the day that the NBA canceled its season and Tom Hanks announced he had coronavirus. Those both happened on the same day, and it was like, whoa, we got to do something. So I think it was like the next day or something was March 13th. So I waited to see if there was any pictures coming out of that event, and nothing was showing up. And we wondered if they had gone through with it or not. And it wasn't until a few days later that I finally heard from a couple of really good sources that at the last possible minute, they had decided to cancel that event, which is huge. I mean, because, Scientology, this is like their biggest thing all year. So then a little while after that, I started hearing all over the world that Scientologists, no matter where they were in the world, were all being called in for a confidential briefing. And I knew it had to be about that, right? And we saw evidence that, people were said, no, you're not going to get this over email. You have to come down and see this document. So then I got really interested that there was this document out there that existed, and I finally got my hands on it and made it public. I'm not sure what date it was, but it was a couple weeks after the event. And it was dated March 13th, and it was written by David Miscavige, and it was called the Inspector General Network Bulletin number 88, right? And in it, he complains about having to cancel that event, and you can tell he's just furious because David Miscavige does not like being told what to do by government officials. And he sneered at it. He called it hysteria. He clearly, doubts the existence of the virus at all. But that, Scientology is going to, the number one priority, he said in this document, was protect the org. So in other words, protect Scientology over Scientologists. And since then, we've seen that Scientology has had a real schizophrenic approach. They did shut down. Initially, they were telling people, no, come on down to the org and take more classes. In the first few days, they were telling people, you've got to come in because they didn't want to lose that revenue.
Because the orgs are clean, right? Is that the phrase they used?
Well, they kept talking about how they were sanitizing everything and using disinfectant, which of course, it doesn't mean anything because you're going to, as long as you're next to somebody who's infected, the place could be spotless,
right?
But you're going to catch it from that person sitting next to you. So initially we saw them trying to get people just to ignore what the government was saying and come down to the org. But gradually the orgs themselves did start closing. And then, Scientology, what David Miscavige really craves is mainstream acceptance. And so that's why he's got all these front groups that are out there showing up at the scenes of natural disasters, promoting the idea that they have these ideas about drug abuse. It's all quackery. And so they want to appear to be part of the solution. And so what they came up with was this idea of these sanitation teams. And they're taking this cleaning fluid and repackaging it and then sending out these volunteer ministers wearing their yellow windbreakers to hand out this stuff to people to keep their houses clean. Well, we have photos of them doing this without gloves or masks. I mean, they're actually increasing the chance of the virus being spread with these sanitation teams. It's such a disaster. And I've seen evidence of them doing it in South Africa, in Florida, in Los Angeles, in England. This has become the Scientology's idea that they're going to make themselves look like they're helping out by handing out these booklets. And these booklets do have basic advice like wash your hands and stay 6 feet apart. But I mean, weeks after that's already been drilled into our heads by legitimate health organizations, Scientology shows up acting like they're helping. So that's problematic. They keep claiming that these disinfectants are going to help with the virus. And then, but they're still carrying on their auditing and things at the advanced orgs in Florida and California. And we're seeing evidence of people even at this point traveling to get to those places so they can continue doing these auditing. And not only are they auditing, which means people sitting close together doing this counseling, but those bases are run by these small armies of SeaOrg workers who are the people we've talked about who sign billion-year contracts, work 365 days a year for little or no pay, pennies an hour, but they're housed together in bunk beds, literally in bunk beds in these apartments. They're crammed together. And we've been raising this issue, and other people have. And in Florida, they did convince the local sheriff to go down and look at the Flag Land Base. And they put on a show for him. They told him they're not letting people sit together and they're limiting the people on their buses. And the sheriff said, okay, I don't see a problem. But he didn't get to see the birthing. He didn't get to see where these people live. I think there's still an issue with the SeaOrg in LA and Florida. But generally, they're locked down in most places, and people are staying home. And so now they've taken to going on the internet and showing pictures of themselves reading L. Ron Hubbard books at home to kind of keep up their spirits.
That's cute.
I mean, I
like
don't
that.
blame them for doing that. That's kind of cute.
So, and is this postponing of the big event? You said that Miscavige was kind of forced to do that. Is that part of a general policy of the state, or how does that work?
Well, I'm curious exactly how that went down. That venue, Ruth Eckerd Hall, had made an announcement that they were closing down on Sunday the 15th. So I think theoretically, it's possible Miscavige could still have held that event on Friday night the 13th. But he makes reference in the bulletin to government officials. So I don't know yet exactly what went down that night as far as deciding not to have that event. It may be some time before we find out exactly what happened.
And how predictable is the reaction of the church? By which I mean, it's related to a larger question that has been interesting to me of how consistent the overall kind of approach is. Like when I thought, what would Scientology do now with this thing getting so big and everybody having to adjust? I had two suspicions. One is they are always like saving the world, so they need to be doing something like what you were talking about just now with handing out sanitizer and stuff. And then the other part I was less sure of, and I'm still not clear on. I thought, don't they always have something written by Hubbard about any particular issue, and they kind of go back to they find some like piece of the dogma to guide them through this? Is that
Yes, what they did was the Hubbard lecture that they have been citing and passing around to each other is great. It's a 1957 lecture about atomic radiation.
okay?
And it contains the line that radiation is really just a state of mind, and Scientology can handle that. So very clear message that, again, Scientologists are staying home and they're washing their hands and they're following the rules, but essentially they don't believe in the virus. And if you become sick in Scientology, it's always because of what's called PTS, that it's because, you get a cold in when a Scientologist gets a cold, they have to write up an essay about who is making them PTS. They must be connected to somebody who is antagonistic to the church. So they will assume that any Scientologist that gets COVID-19 must be connected to a person who thinks bad things about the church. They don't think that they don't believe in germ theory. So it's gonna, but I say that at the same time that you are seeing them being careful and staying home and following the rules. Many of the public Scientologists. The ones I'm more concerned about are these poor SeaOrg workers who have probably not even been told about the pandemic at this point, who are so completely cut off from the outside world. Still, I mean, I have some eyewitness reports of buses still being full of these workers and too close together. So I think there's a potential for some real spread there in Florida in particular.
Okay, yeah. There's you explaining this logic makes me kind of jump forward. One of the things that I wanted to do today is to go through some of the questions that we've gotten in like the comments over after the conversations we've had, and there's one that I wanted to save until the very end. It's not really a question. It's actually kind of a critique. It's been so long so that I'm not sure what part of what we've said is this critique for, but it's this guy Eugene K is his name. He says, let me provide some corrections to how we've described something, and then he writes this long explanation of about a bunch of stuff in Scientology. It's really fascinating to me, the thing that he says here that is the most interesting to me is he says that his interpretation of the just overall situation with the church is that it's very there's consistency between the kind of original presuppositions that Hubbard puts in, I guess, early on in like Dianetics first. And then it's like, if you, however flawed these suppositions may be, if you take them as the axiom and then you try to build an organization based on this, this is the kind of organizations you're going to build. And does that make sense?
Well, what's the critique? I don't understand.
Well, the critique, we'll have to skip because I don't know exactly what the critique is. He's explaining his understanding. It might be that there's no disconnect actually between what you've said and what he's explaining. But it's like he wrote like 3 pages of his explanation of how this works. And I'll just give you some bits of that to see whether it makes sense to you. So he talks what you just said about if you have a call, that must mean you're connected to somebody who's against you or the church. He's explaining kind of this in this kind of larger framework of like it all makes sense, it's all coherent. And what he says is one of the basic axioms is in Scientology. I think he makes a distinction between Dianetics and Scientology. I think he says that later on when it evolved into Scientology, Hubbard came to say that reality itself is a sort of mental image picture, a complete product of agreed upon considerations, I'm quoting this response now, by all-powerful spiritual beings that we are. Basically, one of the main tenets of Scientology is that reality is a product of collective consciousness that has no independent existence of its own. And then, from that, if there is any sort of a problem that you are experiencing or the church is experiencing, what the problem generally is a mismatch between your intentions, which would manifest perfectly, except that there are intentions of other beings. And if what you want is not happening, then it's because somebody doesn't want it to happen for you. And so from that, you get the disconnection, the approach to the what are they called, suppressive persons, that everything comes from some evil person. Every problem that there is comes from some evil person that is going against your intentions.
Sure. I mean, yeah. The first thing that comes to my mind is the story that Hubbard tells about the planet Ars Laicus, which he tells a story from millions or billions or trillions of years ago, and there was this fantastic city in Ars Laicus when everybody had their own role to play, and there was this one little worker who I can't remember if he was replacing bricks or something, and he suddenly decided not to believe in gravity anymore.
Right.
And the entire city fell because it was all based on everyone agreeing that gravity existed. And this is definitely a bedrock principle of what Hubbard says in so many of his lectures, and that is that the physical universe only exists because we've all agreed that it does. And so, what the point of Dianetics and the point of Scientology is that you were once this godlike thetan, and you have forgotten all of these powers because you have forgotten your past. And what Scientology is all about in the processing is recalling your whole track existence, to remember all the things you've been through for millions and billions and trillions of years. When you do that, you regain all those powers. And Hubbard says that you literally, once you're an operating thetan again, you will be able to crush a planet between thumb and forefinger. So he ascribes all these incredible powers to people. But then he also has this other concept that other people thinking thoughts against you can cancel it all. I mean, it's just, first of all, he can never demonstrate the slightest reality about this. In other words, he can never, he always just, and it's fun listening to him on the lectures, but the way he's talking to a captive audience, and the way he sort of coerces agreement from people by saying, you see what I mean? You know what I mean? And you understand? Mm-hmm. And just so people always kind of go, yeah, even though he never demonstrates once how gravity or the solidity of objects is something that we're all agreed upon. Okay, then show me show me, make something vanish by no longer agreeing with it. They never do. See, so it's it's all based on this idea that reality is something that you dreamed up, and so therefore somebody dreaming something different can hurt you, and you need to become this really powerful being. So sure, it's all these wonderful ideas about how in control we are. And what he'll often do in a lecture is he'll talk about, what you and I might think is an incredible assertion, like that. He at one point he talks about how you should, if you want the best Cadillac, you should just mock it up. In other words, dream it up. You can, with your mind, create a car. Now, you and I would think that that's a pretty incredible assertion, that I could create an entire automobile simply by thinking about it. But what Hubbard will always do is he'll always talk about, we could do that, but that's just so easy. He wants to talk to you about things that are really difficult. See, it's a trick. It's just it's a silly little con man trick to tell people that they can do these things, but why do it when we can do things that are so much better, when they can't do any of that stuff? So I don't know what your reader was trying to get at. Yes, this is basically what Hubbard is always talking about, is that reality is an agreement, but he can never show it. And, Scientologists may all agree that illnesses are only psychosomatic and that Scientologists are impervious to all disease. But guess what? They're all sitting at home trying to keep away from this virus like the rest of us are, because you can't just think away COVID-19. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so that is interesting. Part of my interest here with the pandemic thing is, how do I phrase it? Whether if you take Miscavige or just a usual kind of member of the church, how coherent their worldview is. How is there a disconnect that the person might be feeling between what they think, what the church says, that the doctrine says reality is, and then still you have to follow.
Well, that's why I think Miscavige is so angry, and you saw it in that document that I posted, the IGN Bulletin 88. He's angry, and I think what Scientology is particularly worried about, and you see it as a result, is what they're trying to do with people at home, is, first of all, Scientology always has a lot of churn. Like any of these groups, most of the people that get involved in Scientology only get involved for a very short period of time. They've constantly got to keep people coming in because they're always losing people. And the people that they have in, they're always subjecting them to so many different initiatives and things. It's all control mechanisms. And I think that's what's particularly challenging about this pandemic for Scientology. I think this is what Scientology is panicking about, is all of their usual control mechanisms are being disrupted right now. Mm-hmm. And you got a lot of Scientologists who are sitting at home, who are not going down to the org, who are not being interrogated with sec checks, who are not being regged to death by the fundraisers, who, they're taking pictures of themselves reading books, but how much time are they really spending reading Hubbard? They're doing what the rest of us are doing. They're looking at the internet. They're watching the news. And this is really bad for Scientology, because when they start looking around and seeing what this disease is doing and all these people that are dying, and that Scientology can't do anything about it, just like anybody else, this can, some big ideas can start seeping through that they've been sort of keeping at bay for a long time. So I think this is an opportunity for some families to possibly get through to people that they've had a hard time getting through to. And this will be a serious challenge for Scientology the longer it goes on.
This is really interesting, yeah. I had a conversation once with a friend a long time ago where we thought about, we were talking about like what happens. I think there was like some yet another political scandal in America, and we were just dreaming up these like sci-fi scenario of how things go really, really wrong. And one of the thoughts that popped up there is, I wonder what, if it really goes really bad, if like the USA falls apart USSR style, then maybe these groups like Scientology, who have rules, who have these ties between people, who all even have uniforms, right? Maybe they'll gain power when the society at large is going through a crisis. But this particular crisis seems not exploitable like this.
Well, I think that, right now we're going through a public health crisis, but we also have a looming economic crisis coming with it. And if we did go through a protracted recession, depression, those sorts of economic eras tend to produce more extremism. All right. I mean, it was the Great Depression when the Nazis got into power, and so I would assume that if we get into some serious, lengthy economic problems over this, you could see a lot of groups that normally wouldn't have a lot of power get more people. Now, whether Scientology's well positioned for that, I'm not sure, because Scientology is so expensive. And I'm not sure that Scientology would be the kind of thing that would benefit from a protracted period where people don't have money. So we'll see. I don't know. That's a good question. And the fact that they have uniforms, the fact that, what Scientology sells, what all of these groups sell, is certainty.
Right.
And that's what people will be searching for, a year from now, 2 years from now. I mean, this thing could really go on for a while as far as the economic side of it. And people are looking for answers. And Scientology is one of those groups that says, we have all the answers,
Right.
And that appeals to people at certain times of their lives. But again, Scientology is so expensive. I just don't know if they would do well in a depression.
Yeah, it makes me think. I was recently listening to some lecture by this Russian guy who was talking about his growing up in the late 80s and early 90s. He was in high school, and he's been through a lot of weird little groups, cultish groups like that. And he made this aside comment, it might seem weird to you. Why would an 18-year-old guy go, to all of these weird extreme kind of groups? But if you remember the time, the late 80s, the early 90s, that there were two kinds of groups that I could attach myself to in search for order. There were only two kinds of people who seemed to have answers, and that's organized crime and religious, fundamental religious groups.
Right.
So that's interesting. Another, I don't know how vague or broad this question is, but part of me thinking about this pandemic with, overlaying the reality of Scientology made me wonder, how often does that even happen, that the issues of the day for Scientologists are the same as issues of the day for people outside of the group?
Very rare. Exactly. That's a very good. Yes. Normally, Scientology is so insulated from the outside world, particularly for the SeaOrg workers, that, who's president or, that kind of question just isn't very important to Scientology. They are so focused on a set of beliefs, a set of guidelines, set of rules that were laid down 50 years ago. That's one of the interesting things about Scientology, is how it just doesn't, it resists the change going on all around it. So that, while Scientologists are very much online now and on social media, they still don't computerize their records as far as auditing and that kind of thing. They're still using paper and pen.
Mm-hmm.
And, they don't like to use the telephone for certain things still. So Scientology is very good at resisting the changes going on outside of it. And you're right, this is one of those rare times when the outside world has really impacted it.
Okay. All right, so let me then get to some of these questions that I have printed out. Actually, before we go into that, something that I was not aware of with the first couple of times we did these interviews, and then, at first, we did these interviews, I had the influx of viewers and comments, and I thought, well, that's a topic that people, seem to be really interested in. And then the more I looked into it, the more I realized that apart from this being a topic people are interested in, there's also a community. You and your site have a thriving community of people interested in this topic. You even have a convention called HowdyCon, right?
Right.
And
It's just a small meetup. Unfortunately, we had to cancel this year's because of all the stuff
right.
going on. But we've done. Yeah, it's fun.
But it did make me. I mean, does that not seem a little weird to you that there's this like one group, and then there's another group that's about the first group? That there's a community of people, like a subculture almost of people who are interested in a different, weirder subculture.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you are doing a website like mine, you do your best to create a community. I
Right,
mean,
right.
you can see it in a lot of different websites, a lot of different news sites. Um, this started very early on when I was still at the Village Voice. I became very fortunate that the conversations, going on about my stories were so well stated. People really got to know each other. I've been very fortunate about that for the last, God, it's been 9 years now. And, people come and go, but there's still a great community of people and people that really know their stuff. I mean, people who were in Scientology for 30 years and know it a lot better than I do. So I've always really done what I can to promote that and keep the group together. And, it kind of comes and goes. When Leah Remini's on the air, I have a bigger audience. But it's no, it's definitely something that I appreciate very much. Is the bunker definitely has a strong commenting community, and that's why I did start that HowdyCon thing. It's just a chance to get together with some folks once a year, but it's not a big deal. It's not like a convention or anything. It's just a meetup that lasts a couple days.
Is it is there a core of this audience that's really like people who used to be in the church or have some strong connection like that, or is it more interest?
There are definitely some people who were in a long time who are no longer, in the church, who are very important members of that community. But also a lot of people who were never Scientologists, but just are fascinated by the subject and research it, and just want to know what the news of the day is. And the thing is, if you look at the site, you'll see, a certain number of people that comment a lot, and we have 300, 400, 500 comments on a typical day, but many more people read it than actually comment.
Right.
That's the important thing to keep in mind. I mean, we get thousands of unique visitors a day, and I hear from people all the time that they, the first thing they do in the morning, I mean, that's part of why I post a story at 7 a.m. Eastern, is people know the first thing in the morning, let's see what's going on. And some of them never comment. Some of them don't care to comment. Some of them, disagree with what's on the site. But they know that that's where the latest news is going to be. So that's something that I worked hard to create, definitely.
It's hard to articulate my kind of amusement or whatever the feeling is about this. It's like there's a it's like, I mean, Scientology, I guess, lends itself to it. It's like, if you can be interested in a comic book universe, or you can be interested in a Scientology universe, because it's kind of like a comic book universe.
But I mean, the internet's promoted this kind of thing ever since the beginning. Right. There's always been subcultures around different groups, and I'm fortunate that the conversation is so fun and interesting. I mean, we noticed this early on. People would tell me that, there are other places on the internet that discuss Scientology, but the conversations are really, they can be really intimidating and mean and strange. And we do our best to make it fun and inclusive.
Yeah, well, I've seen it. I mean, the comments that I've been getting are really interesting and insightful. And you're right, people know their stuff. Even when they are just asking questions, you can see that there's people spend time thinking about this stuff. So let me go to some of these questions. So the first one is actually like a real articulation of something I tried to ask you in one of our conversations and just couldn't, I think, formulate it very well. Amy Shu is asking this question. If we were to rid ourselves of all the body thetans, yet we are a thetan, is there an original thetan, or are we soulless or thetanless? So that's something that's been confusing to me too. So this whole process of auditing, you're trying to get rid of all these alien souls that make up your body, kind of, but you're also told that you were an alien soul. So in the end, is there one thetan that's the original one, and how do you decide who's the original one?
Right, that's a good question. I mean, Hubbard is not entirely consistent on some of this stuff, so that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that he kind of said different things at different times. But he said many times that you, as a thetan, are operating this particular body that you picked up in a maternity ward somewhere. I mean, that you had finished your last life.
Mm-hmm.
You then went looking for a new body, and you got into this baby and started growing up with it. And then later, under Scientology auditing, you realize that there were other bodies, other thetans along for the ride, and you want to get rid of them. So I'm not sure, I'm sure a technical person would correct me on this, so I'm not entirely sure if there's an actual species difference between you as a thetan and the body thetans that you're getting rid of. It's just that you happen to get in there first and take over that body, and these others are attached to you and you're trying to get rid of them.
And then the baby before you jumped in is not...
Well, that's a great question. See, that's one of those questions that I think Hubbard kind of got stuck, because the first thing he came out with was Dianetics, and Dianetics was that you just need to go back to the womb to find out these things that were said in your presence that are messing you up today, right. These traumatic incidences that are stored in your cells called engrams. And once you clear these engrams, you become clear and you're the superhuman. He later developed this idea of the thetans and body thetans in Scientology. Well, how do you make those, if you're a thetan and you're just jumping into the baby in the maternity ward after it's been born, well, what happened in Dianetics, according to Dianetics, the most important things you have to deal with are the traumas you experience as a fetus. Well, if you're just jumping into the baby after it's been born now, what about those prenatal experiences? And so he came up with this. He had to create this real Band-Aid approach, and he said, well, there's this thing called the genetic entity, which is sort of a thetan that keeps the body physically going, and it's descended down the genetic line. But then as the thetan, you come in and take over. I mean, listen, it doesn't make sense. This is what I try to tell people who are always asking me questions about, well, shouldn't Scientologists be able to defeat the virus? None of this works. None of it makes any sense. It's all a con man spin. So if you're trying to figure out thetans and body thetans and genetic entities, don't expect that it all adds up to something, because it doesn't. But it's something about that, yeah, you got into that baby first, you're knocking away these other body thetans. And ultimately, what you're supposed to be able to do is become an operating thetan, so that you can operate without a body. And you can just be this, independent spirit that can live and not have to go through these lifetimes and not have to go through the between life implanting. And you're this all-powerful being who can then, as Hubbard said, crush a planet between thumb and forefinger. Right. So that's the goal.
Okay, another question about body. This is a thing that I wasn't aware of. Do I have written down who's asking? Andy H027. There's a bunch of stuff from him, but there's one that caught my eye. He says there's an anecdote about Miscavige that he fears children because they're former body thetans. Is that...
I asked Tom DeVaught about that the other day. Tom worked very, very... Tom knows David Miscavige about as well as anybody. And I had gotten a question in from a reader about how much does David Miscavige believe, because that's always something people ask me all the time.
That's the continuation of this question, yeah. So on the one hand, he seems to be like, this is an argument for him being a true believer, but on the other hand, he refuses to do auditing.
That's right, and so Tom did acknowledge that Miscavige has this fear of children because he believed that their body thetans were more able to disattach from them and come attached to him or some crazy stuff like that. And I asked Tom, I said, if he fears children because of that, doesn't that show that he believes in this stuff? And Tom said that Tom's opinion was that, and there's also another anecdote where he installed these copper rods where you can discharge mental energy into the earth. So it's like another sign that he kind of actually believes what Hubbard was talking about. But Tom said that despite those anecdotes about the children, about the copper rods, he really believes that David Miscavige ultimately just doesn't really believe in Scientology, and that's why he doesn't do auditing. And he's just, he knows that it doesn't work. One of the things Tom says is that, he claims that it cured his asthma, but he's still on very serious asthma medicine. So I don't know, Tom. I've always said that it appeared to me that both Hubbard and Miscavige were the kind of leaders who, while Hubbard really did seem to believe in his body thetans, especially at the end of his life, and Miscavige fears small children, that both of them know the real deal. They know that they're taking money from people for the things that don't work, and they understand the limits of what they're selling, but that they kind of believe and don't believe at the same time. It's kind of the essence of the overall con man. But it's interesting that he believed that at the basic level, Miscavige knew Scientology doesn't work.
Yeah, this does make sense to me, what you're saying, that you can believe and not believe at the same time. I've been trying to think about this even a little more broader than Scientology. People are trying to understand what's going on with the fake news, with the like the flat Earth theory. Suddenly, like this belief that we didn't think would come back is now coming back in weird ways too. And then there's this, like, I thought that there's a kind of a similar quality between how Hubbard relates to truth or reality and how Trump can be so openly, it's not, there's a way of not saying the truth in a very confident manner that to me seems like you're saying, like the basic assumption is the truth is not whatever facts show up. You don't need to analyze reality. The truth is what I say. And then if the reality doesn't match what I say, or even maybe it's a way to resolve these like things that don't add up within the body of knowledge in science, not knowledge, but belief, let's say, in Scientology. It's like if it doesn't add up, then you need to study it more or something, because what I say is precedent. That is the truth. And then you have to, somehow figure out how it all makes sense, or maybe even accept that not everything makes sense. Maybe reality is paradoxical.
Right. Scientology has these sort of built-in excuses for everything. And one of them is that Hubbard laid down an exact and meticulous set of procedures that you have to follow perfectly in order to get the results. So that whenever something in Scientology doesn't work,
didn't do it perfectly.
One of the first excuses is it wasn't standard enough. You didn't follow Hubbard closely enough. So they build in these kinds of things so that, because you'd think after a while, you've been in Scientology for 20 years, you're in for most of $1 million. I still can't levitate, or I can't leave, I can't, create things with my mind. There's always an excuse. Well, you need to get to the next level. You haven't finished yet. You know what I'm saying? They've got all these excuses built in, and you and I might think at some point you start wondering, maybe these guys don't know what they're talking about, and they're very good at making sure you never have that thought, because there's always, don't dare think that, because then you might get interrogated, and that's going to cost you a lot of money. So it's a snitching culture. It's an interrogation culture. And you just never have a moment to sort of think about, maybe these things don't work. And that's why I say why right now is an interesting moment, because now they do have that time. Now they do have the ability to look out on the internet. And so that's why it's a little scary for them right now, I think.
There's another question from Poonam. I don't know if I will pronounce this correctly. Punam Shrivastava, maybe. That actually relates to something that I've heard about. So the Moscow center, I don't know if they're still operating. They seem to always be kind of closing down or under pressure, but they never actually do. But the last time I've heard about them, one of the charges against them was that there was evidence, the police said, there's evidence of them using some kind of drugs within the organization. And this question here is, does Scientology use drugs or mood enhancers in the first meetings? Because I felt quite euphoric the one time I spent a day at the Church Scientology Center. Do you know anything about that?
No, I mean Scientology is adamant about their not using drugs, but as far as euphoric, I'll never forget one guy told me about his first experience in Scientology. He was already middle-aged, and he went down to this. His daughter kept begging him, and so he finally decided to take a course. And he was going through a course, one of these initial courses, and the instructor said, I want you to think about something you've lost and then tell the group about it. And so he, first of all, just the idea of being in this group class and talking about yourself.
Right.
This is one of the things about Scientology. It's so simple, and yet I think people don't think about it too much. And that is, Scientology is all about getting you to talk about yourself. And for a lot of people, that's kind of unusual. They don't share a lot about themselves, especially in a group setting. And so this guy talked about how he had lost this watch that meant a lot, a wristwatch that had meant a lot to him. Then the instructor asked everyone in the class to think about some person they had lost.
Mm-hmm.
And this man then said the reason why that watch had meant so much to him is it was given to him by his father, who he had lost. And he says, Tony, I just bawled. I just started crying in front of this group. I never do that. And he said for the next week, he was walking on air. He felt so euphoric. He felt so great. Now, I would argue there's so many different things going on in that scenario where a private person is talking about things publicly. A private person is talking about pent-up emotions they haven't shared with anyone before. There are so many things to explain why he felt euphoric. But the important thing he said, I felt better than I ever had, and I attributed that to L. Ron Hubbard.
Right.
And I spent the next 20 years of my life chasing that feeling. That was the mistake, thinking that Hubbard had come up with some genius thing, and then he never felt that way again. He just, you then get into this whole interrogation culture, control culture. So they have ways of getting you to talk about yourself that makes you feel like you've lifted off a burden, make you feel great. And then they take advantage of that. So I don't think it has anything to do with drugs.
Mm-hmm.
That's as far as I know, Scientology's not using drugs.
Okay, yeah. You talking just now made me think of a personal anecdote. Let me share that with you because it's related to Scientology. It made me, I thought of the conversations that we've had with you after I had this. What would I call it? There's like a psychological exercise that I was offered by a friend. I was talking about like something personal going on in my life. And they suggested, again, to me, this was framed as a little fun thing to do, but it's similar to auditing with past lives. So the way that the exercise was framed for me is think about the part of yourself that you have an issue with, that is, you're trying to figure out and resolve, and make that a character, and let's make up a life of this character, who this person is, and let's put this person in, let's say, 16th or 15th century or something like that. And so to me, it worked. It was actually very interesting and actually did help me, relate to my own shit by just writing out this, like making up this whole scenario of a person's life, because it would be difficult for me to directly confront some things about myself, like some dynamics within my psyche. But when I'm making this story up, it's easy. And I did feel the same kind of feeling. Like I finally talked about some things that would be not easy to talk about. But the reason I thought about Scientology and talking to you is, in the course of making up this character, I think I actually said, like, and it's, I'm a terrible kind of person. And then when the whole thing was over, I thought of the things that I've said, and I realized it was actually very much like Ivan the Terrible. Like the character that I constructed was very similar, at least to like my own image of a historical figure. And that made me think, you said that one of the reasons that Scientologists, or like that would be your interpretation, one of the reasons why Scientologists are heavily discouraged from talking to one another about their auditing sessions is because you find out that everybody was Jesus or Caesar or Cleopatra or somebody else.
Right.
And when you said that the first time when we talked, my interpretation of that was like the psychological kind of drive behind that was, everybody wants to be special. Everybody wants to be Jesus or Caesar or somebody prominent. But after doing this little exercise myself, I thought the reason people end up telling these stories that seem very much like Jesus or Caesar or whatever is because these stories are still around because they resonate, because there's something about the story that makes it easier for us to relate to the human condition or to our own life or to something like that. So it's just a story, but do you have any reaction or thoughts on this?
Well, I think generally I agree with the idea that Scientology takes advantage of the idea that we are all a little disappointed. Every one of us we're all a little disappointed that our lives are as ordinary as they are. And that we imagine ourselves being the central figure in this vast narrative that we watch on television or that we read in books. And it disappoints us that we're not starring in that kind of a drama. And, I think for most of us, we just, deal with it in ways that, well, we have family that we love and we have careers that are important to us, and things are always uncertain, and we're going to face adversity, and we just do the best we can. And unfortunately, there is no human being owner's manual that we can consult to figure out the best way to get through things. But Scientologists, are part of this Gnostic tradition that this, vessel contains this godlike spiritual being who is actually part of this vast galactic narrative. That it's so part of so much fantasy literature and that kind of thing. The chosen one, who is like this small character, like a hobbit living in a village, who turns out to be the most important, crucial being in a vast planet-wide narrative. We all, those are great stories, and we love those stories. And Scientology is very smart in taking advantage of it. Gives everybody the opportunity to then create that narrative through this auditing, this past life auditing. And it's repetitive, it's trance-like, and you dream up these incredible things where, oh yeah, I'm running a whole planet. And then there's this machine that tells you, no, you didn't dream that up. That actually happened. And then, so this would never work on me. I'm sorry. I understand the limits of the human condition, but for some reason, some small number of people are very susceptible to the idea that the reality they see around them is just a sort of matrix, and they're actually part of this much more interesting, larger narrative of them as some galactic hero, who 2,000 years ago was Jesus Christ, but 4 million years ago was the warlord of a planetary system or something. They love that idea, and they dream it up, but that they're convinced by the e-meter that it's not a fantasy, but something that's real. So that's at the core of why Scientology is able to take so much money from people for such a long period of time. They get addicted to that feeling, euphoria about themselves in this story they're dreaming up.
I did wonder after that little thing that I did, like, it had an effect on me, even though not only I was aware that I'm making this shit up, but it was set up as let's make some shit up, but it's a creative exercise that allows you to connect with it.
As a creative exercise, as role playing, these are basic techniques that therapists use to help, like you said, get people to talk about things that otherwise would be difficult to talk about. That's great, as long as you're aware that it's something that you're making up and it's something that's not real. I mean, the problem I have with some therapists is that, this was especially true about 20 years ago, 30 years ago. We had a group of very unethical therapists that were encouraging people to dream up stuff and then convincing them that it happened. And that created all kinds of, with the repressed memory stuff, created some really bad problems, particularly in the 1990s.
It is on my list of things to look into. Some call it, what is it, satanic ritual abuse panic?
The Satanic Panic.
Yeah.
The Satanic Panic of the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, it's so irresponsible what some of these therapists were doing. It's like, okay, I mean, when you're in a trance state or you're trying to remember things from the past, you might remember something that's not real. And therapists will tell you it's not important if it's not real, if it helps you, make a new understanding. But it's a therapist that were saying, well, that must have actually happened to you.
Right.
Really, where my parents were part of a satanic cult and they were eating babies, that really happened? It must have. You remembered it, and that created this whole set of problems. And I'm not sure how prevalent it is today, but Scientology loves that. I mean, Scientology is based on that idea that you're going to remember these incredibly outrageous things, and then the e-meter tells you, yeah, that really happened. That's at the bedrock basic of Scientology processing.
I'm sure we've talked about this before already, but is there like a general, like on the scale from positive to negative approach to these things that people quote unquote remember? Is there does the auditor try to steer them towards like something that's not, your parents were Satanists who were eating babies, or not?
Well, I don't want Scientology's not doing that, right. But that was with Satanic Panic. But it's Scientology will tell you that their auditors follow this strict code where they're not suggesting anything, and that they can't evaluate anything that you come up with, and they're just encouraging you. Mm-hmm. Well, you said this thing, and the meter reacted in this way. There's maybe something else there. What is it? And they just keep pushing you and pushing you and pushing you. And in that kind of when you've been asked the 400th time, what else happened in that, you'll start dreaming stuff up. And again, the auditor's not there to try to create that. They're not trying to steer you, but they are trying to get you to come up with this stuff and push you and push you and push you.
Okay, yeah. I kind of like jumbled these papers with the questions, so this might be the last one because I've lost track of what I asked and what I didn't. There's one question about, well, the first sentence is, where do you feel the line is between Scientology's lust for money and his dedication to the tech? But what it means is, I think maybe you've said yourself that the rule for the really, like the celebrities of top caliber or really wealthy people is there are no rules for these particular people. But on the other hand, there is adherence to what they call tech, right? Is there a particular point? Well, first, I guess, is it true that the adherence to the dogma or to the way things are done kind of disseminates once you or wealthier than a certain amount, or have influence more than a certain amount?
Well, a couple of different questions there. I mean, on the one hand, the celebrities do all the same auditing. Mm-hmm. It's one thing that's important to keep in mind: is the celebrities do these crazy tasks that everyone else has to do. They're just allowed to break some rules that other people can't. So, for example, the sort of average Joe who joins Scientology has to follow just a dizzying number of special codes and rules, and they might face expulsion if they don't cut themselves off from another family member, and it's all very strict and very cruel. A celebrity is going to get to ignore some of those rules, and a celebrity is going to be able to defy disconnection. But they still go through all the same kinds of things. And Leah Remini went through intense interrogations and punishments and all kinds of things. But the other question, I guess, is there some place where the tech and the lust for money go different ways? Right. I would say absolutely not. I mean, no matter what issue somebody is facing, the solution is almost always purchase more intensives. You got an issue, well, then you need more intensives, and intensives are incredibly expensive. So there's never a case. I can't think of a case where somebody was like, well, this might not cost any more money, but it's the right thing to do. I mean, Scientology they never arrive at that point. Everything is always about more money, always. That's what they worship, is money. People ask me, what does Scientology worship? They worship money.
All right, that's a damning conclusion. So I guess that's kind of, let's see. I think this is kind of it for stuff that I've prepared. I wonder if there's something else to say about like the current state, given the current state of the Scientology, given the state of the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting time because we really expected 2020 to be the year of the lawsuit. There were several lawsuits filed last summer, and it takes a while for lawsuits to get to a point where things are really happening. And I think a lot of us expected that 2020 would be just an amazing year for lawsuits that have been filed by this national legal team on behalf of some really interesting people, like Leah Remini's assistant, Valerie Haney, had filed a lawsuit. These women who are accusing Danny Masterson of rape, they filed a lawsuit. And so mainly because of Scientology's, scorched earth litigation techniques, those lawsuits have run into some problems that have been really kind of disconcerting, particularly Valerie Haney's lawsuit. And then everything's on hold. I mean, all the lawsuits have been pushed off because the courts are not operating. So I think that I'm still keeping up on those lawsuits. In fact, just today I had a piece about a development in one of those lawsuits, and those will continue. But I think a more immediate challenge to Scientology is how well will they survive the pandemic? Because, like I said, to me, the most interesting thing about it is all these Scientologists who are stuck at home, who now have an opportunity to maybe kind of look around. And the outside world really is intruding on Scientology right now in a way that doesn't usually happen. And I can tell you that there are a lot of people right now who are disconnected from their loved ones, who are hoping this gives them an opportunity to think about things. And, that would be the best result of this, terrible thing that we're all going through. The best result would be it would lead to another large exodus of people from Scientology. There was a very large one about 10 years ago, and it would be very interesting to see if there was another exodus now. I don't know if that's going to happen or not. I am showing some evidence I've seen that Scientologists are still, supporting each other online and encouraging themselves to keep reading Hubbard and get through this. So, Scientology's very resilient. We've seen that time and time again. So it'll just be very interesting to see how well they do. But this is definitely an interesting moment for this group, and I would assume for other groups like it. I wonder how some of these other controlling groups are doing during a period like this.
And these, you're saying Scientologists encourage each other to read Hubbard at home and stuff like that. Is there anything that, like the church as the organization trying to do, move some things online, or is there some kind of like action to keep these connections stable?
Right. Yes, the church is encouraging people to do extension courses at home, and the church has actually started making more videos public. I just posted. I found out that the New York org did a Sunday service online, and today I just posted another video from the San Francisco org, which is so unlike Scientology. First of all, Sunday service. You have to understand that Scientology is all about you and your auditor. It's not really a group activity. And so they have Sunday service purely as a sop to the public, because the public expects that something that calls itself a church will have a Sunday service. I've talked to Scientologists that were in Scientology for 20 years and never went to a Sunday service. It's just a public relations thing. So for them to be putting Sunday service online for the public to look at, that's very unusual, and tells me that they're scrambling. They're trying different things. I think Miscavige is throwing out a lot of different ideas, the sanitation thing, extension courses, Sunday service. So that's something we're keeping an eye on to see that they clearly understand that this is a big challenge, and they're trying different things to keep people focused on what they want them focused on.
It's interesting. Just one last thought that occurred to me just now is, I think also we've said in one of these conversations that one of the big challenges for Scientology is like the internet, that the information, that the stuff that in like the 80s was really secret and kept in whatever sealed room, and you can't approach this document. Now there is information travels much freer than before, and the secrecy thing is not working out. And I'm wondering if something has changed about this general dynamic, like our impression of what the internet does with the dissemination of information. Maybe it was a little naive in the beginning, because as I've mentioned a few times in this conversation, there are weird bubbles of like reality bubbles that emerge from the internet, from people getting reinforcing belief or ideas that would be fringe or would be in the everyday consensus reality would be looked down on. But now there's like the suggestion algorithms on YouTube that propose you more and more videos that support some kind of theory. Do you think this kind of like dynamic can in theory help Scientology, that you get enmeshed in like an online web of resources, ideas, discussions, etc.?
Well, I think that Scientology a long time ago could have thought of a way to make the Scientology experience more of an online one, something that you could pay to watch videos at home. And they've resisted that simply because, L. Ron Hubbard's, although Hubbard is still source, and Hubbard is all about books and the sales of books and courses. And, L. Ron Hubbard died before the internet started. Right. So, and his word is still law in Scientology. So they've been very slow to adopt. They're still selling DVDs. I mean, they're still not streaming, lectures and that kind of thing. But on the other hand, people are surprised when I tell them how much Scientologists themselves are online now and on Facebook and Instagram and all that. And they said, Tony, I didn't think Scientologists could go online. Well, SeaOrg workers are not given access to the internet for the most part because they're too busy doing what they're doing. But public Scientologists are online. And so then the question becomes, well, how does Scientology keep a Scientologist online from looking at things they shouldn't look at? And again, we come back to the snitching culture and the interrogation culture. Scientologists know that if they watch this interview or if they watch Leah Remini's show, they could get hauled in for an interrogation that will last weeks, and they get charged for it. And not only that, but if they admit to watching this and watching Leah Remini and talking to people about it, they could be kicked out. And then when they get kicked out, everyone they know, all their family members, cut off contact with them. Severe penalties. So for that reason, Scientologists, even though they're online, even though they're on Facebook, even though they're on YouTube, they're very good at keeping the blinders on and making sure they do not look at or talk about what they call theta, which is this, anti-theta, this bad news about the church. So they are online, but they're very good at controlling themselves. However, right at this moment, when they're at home for such a long period and they're bored, I think the chances go up that they take that risk and start to look at websites like mine.
Okay, well, let's see whether that happens. How are you? This is the end, but how are you holding up? Are you like self-quarantined, staying at home?
Yes, I'm still at home here in the bunker, and the website's TonyOrtega.org, and I'm just I will admit it's gotten a little tougher not for me personally because I work at home anyway, but just with people stuck at home, there's less going on, and the lawsuits have been slowed down. So it's a little bit tougher to have a news story every day, but I'm doing my best, and the community, like I said, like we were talking about earlier, they're great, And in fact, if anything, the engagement from the community's been even higher during the pandemic. So, yeah, I'm still doing fine.
All right. Well, thanks, man. This was, as usual, really fascinating. I'm really grateful to have these conversations.
Enjoyed it, man. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye bye.